Hello everyone and welcome to Commodity Culture. My name is Jesse Day, and on this show we break down the commodity space for both new and experienced investors. Before we dive in, standard disclaimer, nothing here is investing advice. Do your own due diligence. And today I am very excited to welcome back to the show Justin Huhn of the Uranium Insider. Justin, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back, Jesse. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Good to have you back again. And I want to get started as we kick off 2023 here with your thoughts on the major tailwinds for uranium. What are the major catalysts you see that make you bullish on uranium at the moment?
Oh gosh, where do I start? I would say the primary catalysts are the fact that we have a extremely robust environment across the fuel cycle with movement in prices and volume and demand, and how all of that is going to translate into very strong demand for uranium that's already starting, that's happening essentially in the background in the term market. The term market is very, very active, more active than it's been in a decade. We had 114 million pounds contracted in term contracts for 2022. The first year since 2012, that's more than 100 million pounds contracted. So that's a very, very good sign. I think that 2023 is going to be year one of multiple years in a row of replacement rate contracting and then some. So 180, 185 million pounds. I expect to see at least that amount this year contracted in long-term contracts. So that demand coming from the spiking SWU prices, the volume in enrichment is going to come to uranium, and it's coming pretty soon. So that's probably the biggest thing, is just a fundamentally very sound setup across the fuel cycle, and the natural uranium demand that is coming from that, along with this long-term contracting cycle that is just starting. I think that another shorter-term catalysts is probably the resumption of some risk being put on into markets and into the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust in particular. I don't know exactly when that's going to happen, but I know that it will. So spending most of the last year, with a few exceptions, of spot trading at a discount to its net asset value, not able to raise a lot of cash, especially since April when the markets really started to correct. Spot, for example, the month of December 2022, didn't raise a single dime, didn't buy a single pound of uranium. In the last two trading days, it's now raised about $12 million. So that's something. It's coming back a bit. But I think that at some point this year, and probably in the first half of this year, we should see some volume come into the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust. And the fact that there's just not a lot of uranium in the, in the spot market currently, that could be a very, very strong move for the price of uranium. As far as other catalysts go, I would say that Japan is an interesting catalyst, with multiple elements playing out. So one of those is an accelerated timeline for a number of reactor restarts. They're expecting, you had Prime Minister Kishida say that they wanted to have 16 reactors operating by the summertime. I don't think they hit that target, but it does look like there are 3 more reactors that could be restarted by the summertime, which would bring their total to 13. They're still continuing to say that they want to have 20 to 22% nuclear by 2030. That would be another 20 reactors restarted. So we'll see how quickly they get that done. I think that they're obviously being cautious, and depending on the locale of each reactor, dictates whether or not that'll be restarted in a timely manner. But they're moving that direction. And so some legislation that was put forth last month in December of 2022 will actually be voted on in Japan's Diet in the next couple of months. So if that is inked into law, then we should see some finance coming in and some more government support for accelerated restarts. And that's been one of those elements that there's a number of players in this space that have been waiting forever for Japan restarts to basically say, okay, yeah, now the bull market can resume. And the fact that Japan, as a perceived and expected seller of uranium at higher prices, does get into a accelerated reactor situation, they will be a net buyer. And that is a pretty profound shift for not only investor sentiment, but adding Japanese demand to supply and demand models going out. That's a pretty big shift. Yeah.
So there is a new physical fund that is entering the game. from Kazakhstan, and they're planning their IPO. I don't know if it's ANU or ANU Energy, how it's exactly pronounced, but they will be buying pounds directly from Kazatomprom. What are your initial thoughts on how this might impact the uranium market? And kind of a secondary question that I got on Twitter, do you think Kazatomprom will be incentivized to ramp up supply to provide more uranium to this fund?
Good question. Yeah, ANU Energy. So they did an initial $74 million raise. They're going to do a $400 million follow-on in Q2, and then they'll do an additional $100 million upon IPO, which is supposed to be late Q2. So that's $574 million. So just to put it into context, Kazatomprom has already signaled that they plan to increase their production to 10% below subsoil use contracts, compared to 20% below that they've been operating at for the past few years, which is about a 9 million pound a year increase in production by 2024. So in the next 12 to 18 months, they should be ramping up that production. That all is very determinant on how extensively they establish new well fields now. And for 2022, or 2023, that will affect 2024's production. So it depends on labor force and supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. They've got kind of a revolving door in their C-suite, so I'm not really sure what's going on managerially there. But they certainly could achieve it. They definitely have the geology, but they aren't an endless well. I mean, you can even look at the well field modeling and the deposit modeling for their production. They show their production essentially increasing for a number of years, peaking out around 2030, and a pretty precipitous decline in production from them as well. So they're not really incentivized to simply turn on the taps willy-nilly. They know where this market is going, so they can ramp up some production. But a 9 million pound increase in production, that essentially is consumed by the initial raises of this ANU Energy. And now ANU Energy, $500 million at $50 a pound, there's 10 million pounds. Who knows what sort of financial appetite will exist in the East for this vehicle? That remains to be seen. But I believe it'll be relatively robust. And so the way that this is going to function is when they raise cash, issue shares and raise cash, presumably at a premium to their net asset value, that they will then first go to Kazatomprom. In fact, I believe that's mandated within their prospectus. They buy pounds from Kazatomprom. Now, Kazatomprom can say, yeah, we don't want to sell it to you, or we don't have the pounds, and then ANU will go to the spot market. And vice versa. If ANU ever does end up selling pounds, perhaps they will operate similarly to Uranium Participation Corporation, which Sprott took over. And if they do, then if they're at a deep discount to NAV for a considerable amount of time, they can actually sell some uranium and buy back shares. I don't know if that's the way ANU is set up, but I believe it's probably something close to that. So Kazatomprom's ramping up is not really a concern, especially when you consider the incredible deficits that we're looking at in the coming years between supply and demand. It honestly gets to the point where you almost want to see that production increase for the health of the sector, simply because we're looking at a major deficit in production unless we have vastly higher prices and the marginal projects can develop. That's really what we're looking at towards the end of the decade is not enough uranium.
Right. And now running counter to that, there's some people out there who are talking about there's a supply glut. We have plenty of uranium out there. One of them is Warren Urban, who I consider to be quite a smart guy, but he's come out in a few interviews recently saying, slow down, uranium bulls. There isn't really as much of a supply-demand imbalance as most investors in the space believe. Now, it feels like he's talking mostly about uranium in the ground in many cases, and missing from his thesis is the incentive price to actually mine the uranium. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on statements like that, and maybe you could clarify and give us your view on how the supply-demand picture currently stands and the factors that may influence it moving forward.
Sure. Well, I don't know Warren personally, but I have listened to multiple interviews of his over the years. I think he's very sharp. He's a very successful investor, and I absolutely respect his opinions on things. I think that his essential understanding seems to be coming from one or maybe two people within the nuclear world telling him that a lot of supply will become available at higher prices. Now, I don't know where that information is coming from. I don't know who his particular contacts are that informed him of this, but I tend to disagree. I don't believe there's going to be a lot of supply. Presumably, there's plenty of uranium held in strategic inventory. So for example, there's more than 1 billion pounds held in inventory. Okay. But that's being held by actual nuclear utilities that are going to be utilizing this as fuel in their reactors and or strategic inventories for governments. So, China, for example, has somewhere between 300 and 400 million pounds of inventory. That is yet to hit the market in any meaningful way for sales. And the fact that they're drastically expanding their nuclear fleet would make it relatively unwise to be selling that inventory, considering that China has very little in-ground uranium. They have very little uranium wealth within their geography, in geology, I should say. So for somebody like Warren, who has made very intelligent bets in next-gen and ISO energy, going after high grades, that's what he understands. That's what he does well. He's already made a killing on next-gen and presumably on ISO as well. So for him to kind of plant his flag and say, when uranium reaches X amount of dollars per pound, I'm out, I have absolutely no problem with that whatsoever. But the argument that there's plenty of uranium out there, therefore calm down bulls. I mean, that to me, that says I don't understand the nuclear fuel cycle, and I haven't crunched the numbers. Because as soon as you start modeling this stuff out and looking at the reactors that are uncovered and the amount of uranium that needs to be purchased, then you recognize we're talking about hundreds of millions of pounds of shortage by the end of the decade. That's really what we're talking about. Yeah.
You touched on China there and that they do have a strategic reserve of uranium. They're also emerging as one of the leaders in the nuclear space, with 53 reactors currently operational, a goal to build at least 150 more in the next 15 years or so, on top of planned construction of around 30 reactors in countries involved in their Belt Road Initiative by 2030. So do they have enough reserves to fuel all of these reactors, or are they going to be relying on China General Nuclear and Kazatomprom? Is that enough to cover their needs, or will they have to look elsewhere? I guess my overall question is all these reactors coming online in China a big part of the bull thesis for you?
It's definitely a significant, important element to the bull thesis. Because they make up the largest player with new construction. So they're building 22 reactors right now under construction in the country. I mean, that's almost half of the total reactors under construction. Now, there's other places in the world that are ramping up nuclear adoption and looking at new builds and actually breaking ground on new builds. So it's not just China, but they are the biggest player. So if China were to all of a sudden come to a screeching halt in terms of their build outs and their plans for nuclear, that certainly would affect supply and demand modeling. It also would probably affect how aggressive they might be in the future of acquiring new projects or building out new development projects. But yes, CGN, we're looking at JVs in Kazakhstan and the Husab mine in Namibia. These are really their big projects. Langer Heinrich, they've got a stake in Langer Heinrich. Rossing, they've got 20% of fission. I don't know if that'll ever develop or not. We'll have to see. But they don't have a lot of uranium in the ground. And so if we're talking about them actually hitting their goal of 200 gigawatts by 2035, so that's 200 gigawatts that's 100 million, almost 100 million pounds of uranium per year just for China. So when you put that into context, recognizing their 300 to 400 million pound inventory, that looks pretty meager. So yes, is enough uranium coming out of Husab and Rossing and Kazatomprom joint ventures to satisfy 200 gigawatts of nuclear? No, not even close. So if they continue on this path, and of course those are their goals, are they keeping up with those goals? No, they're not. They're still, I think only had one reactor hit the grid last year, probably 3 or 4 this year. But to hit 200 gigawatts by 2035, we're talking 8 to 10 per year. So they have to pretty much really get a fire under the butts here in order to meet that goal. But either way, they're probably going to be looking at new projects going forward. Most likely that'll be in Africa for the most part. I think that's the friendliest jurisdiction from them. And perhaps further JVs in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan perhaps as well.
I want to shift a little bit to the energy crisis in Europe that's largely driven by insane ESG policies, and with a bit of a spotlight on Germany here. I had John Polomy on the show recently, and he was talking about the fact that they've spent an incredible sum of money building out renewable energy, and the end result is they're having to mine the dirtiest coal imaginable, which is lignite, for energy. There's some people out there saying, I'm not saying this is a fact, but there's some people pointing to the fact that this is causing in excess of 1,000 deaths a year. There are villagers being displaced to mine this coal. I mean, there's some dystopian pictures going around Twitter. I don't know if you've seen that, with these kind of riot gear wearing cops guarding this lignite mine. And we're adding to this soaring energy.
What a stunning photograph that was.
Yeah,
right?
it looked like a Ridley Scott movie or something like that. But you add to this the soaring energy prices. It looks like they're essentially deindustrializing in front of our eyes. Many of their major manufacturing is moving overseas or just having to shut down completely. I cannot make heads or tails of this. What are your thoughts there on them shutting down nukes and mining coal? And do you think it's going to take a complete collapse of German society, a complete change of political leadership? When are people going to wake up, and when, if ever, are these policies going to change in your view?
I think about this a lot because honestly, I think that one of the most probable, I would say, or one of the most likely bear cases, if there is going to be one, for nuclear, for uranium, is just countries not doing what actually is right and best for their citizens. I mean, that's really, when you crunch the numbers, it's such an unbelievably obvious solution, but it's no guarantee that that various countries around the world are going to adopt that solution. So, then I also come back often to comedian Adam Carolla's classic line, which is "stupid" or "liar," and I tend to think about a lot of various elements across society with that lens for some reason, probably because it kind of makes me laugh every time I think about it. But obviously, the German elite are not stupid. Do they actually have nefarious intent by deindustrializing their country and skyrocketing energy prices for their citizenry? I don't know. I think the most likely answer is probably just that there's a certain segment of society there, and in many countries, that is completely wrapped with ideology. And I think that it becomes almost like a religion, and it's almost impossible to think outside of that framework. And that's the only thing I can really think of, is like the German Greens. They just adopted this stance, and it's so embedded within that part of the culture that they simply cannot see outside of the lens of that ideology. I honestly think that's the most likely explanation. I also heard something really interesting not that long ago, which was that, oh gosh, I think it was post Chernobyl. So this must have been late 80s, early 90s, that there was a children's book written in Germany that had to do with basically a nuclear disaster. And supposedly this book was very widespread and endemic into the culture when it spread around and was read widely by the entire German society for a period of time. I don't know if this is true. I haven't done my own research to confirm this, but I found that very interesting on how certain ideologies can become embedded within societies. I think oftentimes it starts with the youth. And so that's just kind of where we're at. Now, will we see them extend beyond April? I'm not holding my breath, but it certainly is the obvious thing for them to do. And various countries around them are adopting nuclear, expanding nuclear. Poland signed a deal with Westinghouse to build 3 AP1000 reactors. That will be Poland's first nuclear reactors. Poland, of course, has the dirtiest grid in all of Europe, followed second by Germany. So, their neighbors are mostly in favor of or adopting nuclear. Even Belgium, that just shut down Doel 3 against all logic, has now allocated 10-year life extensions for 2 other reactors. So, need is the mother of invention. So we'll see. We'll see how it pans out. But I don't have a great explanation other than this is just an ideological fundamental situation there that they can't seem to break out of, even if it makes most sense for the country and for their people.
Yeah, that's very interesting what you pointed out about that there might be a children's book about that, because also recently, German residents have been told to prepare for nuclear emergencies. The president of the Federal Office for Radiation Protection warned. This was on the 29th of December. He basically pointed out radiation does not stop at the borders, claimed that an ongoing military conflict between Moscow and Kiev has made it clear to the German residents that we have to be and remain prepared for a wide variety of nuclear emergencies. But so that's kind of more on the nuclear war front, but he pointed out he also criticized Germany's neighbors who have not phased out nuclear energy from their power grid. And he says, on the contrary, many of our neighboring countries are planning new power plants. And he was warning of this was somebody else from the German government, but warning of the risks of accidents at these facilities. So that not only are they fear-mongering about a nuclear fallout sort of nuclear war situation, they're then directly connecting it to nuclear energy, which is the most insane sort of propaganda I could ever imagine. I don't have a question there. That brought to mind the connection between, maybe it's kind of embedded in the culture in a way, which is very unfortunate. But I wanted to get your thoughts on the potential of nuclear energy in combination with renewables, because that's one of the other things that's being kind of pushed from some proponents in the nuclear space and the renewable space. I think it's a good step forward from only 100% renewables, but I had Brian Gitt on the show a while back, and he's an expert in the energy space, and he was saying he thinks renewables should just not be a part of the equation. In his mind, it was more about using nuclear in combination with natural gas. So I'm wondering what your views are on that subject.
I mean, I would tend to agree with him. I think that there is a place for renewables, but I think that place is relatively limited. I think that it's even in places like California, where I'm at, where we have some pretty vast solar PV and solar thermal grids, that we have a 4% penetration of electric vehicles and energy shortages, where they're asking people not to charge their electric vehicles. And so I think that renewables can only make up a certain minority percentage of any grid without destabilizing it. I think that going forward, we're probably going to see improved battery technologies. Perhaps we'll see improved grid scale battery technologies. I just don't like it. I don't think it's a great solution. Buffered wind or solar, meaning that if you calculate, the energy return on invested of wind or solar, including the battery backup systems necessary to buffer these systems for when the wind isn't blowing and the sun's not shining, the energy return on investment is well below what the world needs to maintain society in operations as we are now. So, we're talking about an EROI of 7 to 10 to kind of keep life going as it is in modern society, and we're looking at 1, 2, 3 to 1 for wind and solar buffered. So, I think, rooftop solar for off-grid situations, I think is smart and is a great solution. I think it has its place, but because of the intermittency and the inherent destabilization of the grid that have large percentages of renewables, I think you have to couple that with baseload power that can cycle very easily. And that's not nuclear. At least it's not traditional nuclear. It's difficult to cycle large nuclear plants up and down significantly all the time. That's not something that is easily accomplished with a large-scale nuclear plant. Far more easy with coal or natural gas. I don't know that anybody is really pushing for coal besides perhaps Alex Epstein, who's some of his work I do appreciate. But I think coal, even if you're not in the anti-carbon camp, I think that most people are against the other pollutants that come from burning coal that are obviously harmful for the environment. But all of that is to say, there are some advanced nuclear reactor designs that can cycle far more easily. One of those would be, for example, TerraPower's Natrium reactor, which I believe is a 340 megawatt reactor that can cycle up to 500 megawatts for up to 5 hours. And it stores excess energy in the form of heat in molten salt, and it can pull that energy back in and ramp up its output. And that can happen very easily. And then X Energy's XE100, I believe, also can ramp up and down its output within something like a 12-minute span. So it can do that very, very quickly. And so some of these advanced reactor designs could very well work in tandem with renewable sources. So, but of course, you know, you have to put those renewables into context of location. You know, not everywhere has abundant offshore wind and the geography to support that. And obviously the sun doesn't shine everywhere. I mean, even in sunny southwestern United States, solar energy has, you know, a 25 to 30 on the best day, in the best case scenario, capacity factor, 25 to 30% capacity factor, where in Germany, it's something like 11% capacity factor. Makes zero sense to build out solar in Germany. And a crazy statistic that I just heard from Doomberg and a couple of other sources as well over the past week or so. Germany, a lot of people know that Germany spent about $500 billion on their Energiewende establishment of solar and wind, and as well as biomass, but primarily solar and wind. And they did that in the 2010s as they phased out nuclear. That has resulted in the highest cost of energy in all of Europe and the dirtiest grid, with an exception of Poland, in all of Europe. 500 billion, into renewables. Well, guess what? This winter, since they've shut down 3 nuclear reactors last year, December of 2021, they only have 3 nuclear reactors remaining. Obviously, their gas supplies have been not reliable. They basically went out and bought every unit of energy they possibly could in terms of natural gas, in terms of coal, in terms of biomass. They expanded their gas plants. They expanded their coal mining. They spent $500 billion to get through this winter. This winter. So, I mean, if they had spent that once on nuclear, they'd be good to go for the next 80 years. But you know, again, ideology. I can't even fathom. It's truly alarming.
Yeah, totally insane. I wanted to shift back to the good news of how awesome uranium is, and not dwell so much on these ESG policy failures and the fact that, you know, their whole society may collapse. And I want to touch on how this uranium bull cycle might differ from the last one pre-Fukushima, because, you know, there was a lot of fervor that got built up when Sput came onto the scene and started buying up pounds, and, you know, noticeably affected the market. All the equities were going up and people thought, this is it, now we're on a rocket ship to the moon. At least, you know, uranium Twitter did. And so you're seeing a lot of, I don't know if I want to say bearish sentiment, but people are getting impatient. And I think a lot of people are looking at the parabolic move to the upside pre-Fukushima and kind of thinking that it's going to be the same this time around. In your view, is that correct? Or do you think it's going to be maybe a longer and more protracted bull cycle this time around?
I mean, the fundamentals are there to support a very long bull market for the commodity. But with that said, I think the odds are on the side of a price spike happening. And I think the longer that we go in a sideways fashion in terms of the price of uranium, that is to say, I mean, uranium was up 13% last year, but the equities underperformed the metal by about 35%. Now, I think that reverts this year. I think we see the equities outperform the metal, and I think the metal has a great year. So I think we're setting up for a very, very good year for the equities. I don't know about the next week or the next month or two, but 2023 on balance should be very, very strong for both the commodity and the miners, in my opinion. But I'm just saying that the more amount of time that passes where we don't have a sustained price of uranium above, let's say, $90 a pound, the more likely we are to see a price spike. The other element that I think just can't be ignored is, like you mentioned, is the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust and ANU Energy and Yellowcake, but really specifically SPUT because of the ATM vehicle. It's like, do you think at some point financial flows will come in hard into this vehicle? If you do, then we're going to have a price spike. If you don't, then maybe we won't. We'll grind higher for a number of years. I'm happy either way. Honestly, it's healthier for the sector if we don't have a price spike. It's healthier for the companies involved that actually are wanting to produce Yellowcake. But the price spike, in my opinion, I'm not going to say it's inevitable, but looking at the structure of the spot market right now, there's not a lot of material there. A lot of material shook out of that was held in carry. Let's say traders that were holding pounds on their books for delivery to a utility in the midterm sold pounds to the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust when the market got super backwardated on that spike in August through October into November of 2021, where you had the spot price go up to 55 bucks a pound. The term price was still in the high 30s. And you had these traders sell those pounds they were holding to Sprott for 50 bucks and then cover by securing a midterm contract with Kazakhstan or the Uzbeks or whoever it might be for 42 bucks a pound, whatever it was, and arbitrage and scalp that 8 bucks. So they did that all day long during that backwardated market. That probably shook out 15 to 20 million pounds that were held in carry. That was a significant buffer. I'm not saying that's not there anymore, but it's not as deep as it was before. So it's not going to take a lot of money into the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust to cause very, very large jumps in the price. And gun to my head, do I think it's going to happen? Yes, I do. But it's not my bet. That's not my bet. It's important to understand the fundamentals of the sector, to understand the fuel cycle, to model out supply and demand, to look at the uncovered requirements for utilities, look at the growth of the sector and the projected growth of the sector, et cetera, et cetera. That's where my primary bet is. But do I think the price will spike? Yes. Do I think that will spike in the next 1 to 2 years? Yes.
Great. I like that answer. Do your due diligence, and it doesn't really matter either way. So could you give us any updates on what you're seeing in regards to potential sanctions on Russian conversion and enrichment, along with utilities potentially moving away from Russian uranium supply? You know, this was a big story last year. I'm wondering, has it actually picked up steam in the real world? Was this just a lot of jawboning, or are utilities actually actively looking to get away from Russian supply? How are you seeing this at the moment? Do you have any updates for us there?
I would say that utilities are mixed, and that probably has to do with how much inventory they're sitting on and what sort of position they're on, how covered they are out into the future. To generalize, European utilities are sitting on more inventory than in the US. And so they are far more in favor of cutting off Russian supply. As far as I can tell, and from what I'm hearing from my various contacts, utilities in the West, generally speaking, are not signing new contracts with Russia. And that's not just a political statement, that's actually a security of supply type of statement. So if you're a utility in the US or in Canada or in Japan or in Europe or wherever you might be, and you're wanting to cover your needs going out to the end of the decade, you also kind of have to project on the likelihood of you being able to actually receive those deliveries going out years in advance. And that's not really all that safe of a bet. With that said, hearing that there are certain utilities that are wanting to seek more Russian supply and are in fact trying to lobby to be able to buy in excess of what the Russian suspension agreement will actually allow here in the United States. I can't name names, I'm not going to. But they're not the majority. That's a couple of utilities in the States. For the most part, new contracts for Russian enrichment, conversion, U3O8, fabricated fuel, not happening in the West as of now. The latest I've heard, I mean, there was some whispers coming across Twitter earlier today and yesterday that the EU, the next round of sanctions coming from the EU could target Rosatom. I don't know whether or not it happens. The EU is in a far better position to actually do so. We'll see how that pans out. Again, it's not our bet that Russia actually gets cut off and physically, officially sanctioned. I also don't think that Russia will voluntarily renege on agreements and not deliver. There's been some speculation about that. Yes, of course, in times of war, these things can happen. But Russia, as far as I can tell, is wanting to remain on the world stage as a reliable producer and deliverer of various commodities. And they have a huge export book in terms of nuclear reactors that they're building out. We did see the Finns renege on a contract with Russia and say, "Oh yeah, we're not going to have you guys build that reactor after all." And that was within a couple of months at the start of the war. So more of that could happen, but I don't see Russia cutting anyone off of uranium voluntarily. Again, it could happen, but probably not going to happen because I think that they want to maintain as a reliable source of those services and materials.
And on the other side of the coin, we also had talk of a U.S. strategic reserve of nuclear fuel that was apparently that there was some funding set aside from that. A lot of the companies in the U.S. were talking about that. UEC was talking about that. So I'm wondering, has anything come to fruition on that end? Have they actually started buying pounds, or do they have any plans to buy pounds? Or are you aware of how that's advancing?
They have. Quite a few years in the making. So back in Section 232 days, which I think was 2018 when that first started, maybe even 2017. No, I think it was 2018 when UR Energy and Energy Fuels petitioned the Department of Energy or the Department of Commerce to have a 20% quota for U.S. utilities to have to buy 20% of their uranium needs from domestic sources. That, of course, did not pan out. President Trump at the time looked that over, said, yeah, we're not going to do that. But I think they make some important points about the security of this country and having 20% of our electricity grid essentially reliant on Russia or Russia influenced sources like Kazakhstan. So Trump established a working group, nuclear fuels working group, that went on for, I believe, 6 to 9 months. They came out with their conclusions to establish a strategic reserve for uranium. Nothing ever happened with that. That was 2020. I think that there were bigger fish to fry for Trump that year. So that year panned out. Nothing happened. But bring us to 2022, end of 2022. The DOE is actually buying uranium. They have actually awarded, I think it was 4 contracts to 4 different companies. Domestic miners of uranium, and made a deal. So I think that they purchased something around 2 million pounds of uranium, if I recall correctly, maybe a little bit less. If I recall correctly, this program will be somewhere around 2 to 3 million pounds of demand of domestic uranium going forward, as long as that funding is in place, which it looks to be. Then there's also the DOE's establishment of a HALEU circuit, the high assay low enriched uranium, which is going to be fuel for various advanced reactor designs. That's going to take a while to get established. And part of the reason for that, not only is just the centrifuges being established to produce higher levels of enrichment, but the actual handling of higher enriched uranium and the transportation of it, et cetera, all of that has to be worked out. That's going to take a while. But that HALEU circuit that they're attempting to support with federal funding will also be buying uranium from a couple of choice companies. Now, I've heard that there's a stipulation within that HALEU program that the uranium has to be purchased from private land, not public land that's leased, but actually privately owned land. I don't know if that's true or not, but if that's true, that narrows it down to 2 or 3 companies. I'll let your listeners figure that out. But that's another 2+ million pounds a year of uranium demand, but that's not going to start, I think, for a couple of years.
Great. Awesome update. It's been amazing talking to you, always so informative. For those who want to hear more from you, could you let us know about the Uranium Insider newsletter and also anywhere else you'd like to direct people online?
Sure, yeah. So Uranium Insider is the only 100% uranium and nuclear focused newsletter that I'm aware of. We've been doing it for 3.5, almost 4 years now. We write a 40+ page in-depth letter once a month. We have email bulletins that have to do with trade alerts and company and sector news. And we do once a month members-only webinars. They go super in-depth, 2 hours, where we geek out on the sector, go really deep into the fuel cycle fundamentals primarily. And also have special guests on. We've had John Chapaglia from Sprott, Grant Isaac from Cameco, a couple of other players that I don't want to mention because they'll represent the companies that we support. And then, of course, we have our focus list portfolio of companies that we own and recommend. And those we have a process for choosing those companies that involves looking closely at the balance sheet, looking at the jurisdiction of their projects, looking at management, looking at the share structure, which is very important, So all of those elements have done very, very well for us in our picks over the years. And yeah, it's good fun. I've got a dedicated small team behind me, and we think there's a very bright future for the coming years for the sector.
Awesome. Well, I'll put a link in the description below if anybody wants to check that out. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have to, it's going to be an exciting year. I agree with you. So we'll have to catch up before the year is done to get another update from you.
I look forward to it. Yeah, always good to talk to you, Jesse.
Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.